I've visited the Steven Udvar-Hazy branch of the National Air and Space Museum many times. And on this trip, instead of taking a bunch of photos, which I've already taken before, I thought I'd take a brief movie of some of what I think are the highlights of the museum. The main hall is called the Boeing Aviation Hangar, and it's modeled after an old dirigible hangar. Down below the mezzanine, on one side is a collection of aircraft engines. And on the main hangar floor on this side are jet aircraft from the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and other recent periods, but not including airplanes that are still flying in the service today. Here's a Vought F4 Corsair. The centerpiece of the museum is an SR-71 Blackbird. This is the last one that flew and flew from the Los Angeles area, as I recall, to the airport here in slightly over 1 hour. Also hanging right over the main entrance is a P-40 from early World War II. And then the other side of the museum has a rather mixed bag but fascinating collection of unusual and historically important aircraft. Off to one side of the lobby is the ticket counter, and also you can get some snack food here, popcorn and drinks and so on. And behind it is the IMAX theater, which shows regular IMAX movies as well as 3D IMAX movies. They're always changing the movies they show. And heading the other direction is a raised concourse with a gift shop on one side and also a large McDonald's, which is the only place in the museum to get food besides the popcorn that they have at the concession stand. But you do get a good raised view from this mezzanine. I'm not going to highlight many of the airplanes here. They would take forever because there are a lot of airplanes here. There are a number of flight simulators here. These aren't real ones, of course, but they're ones good enough for the kids to have a little bit of fun in. This red one here is something that I don't think was here the last time I came, and is reportedly a better flight simulator, but I've not been in it. This section of the floor has World War I vintage airplanes, some of them in very rough shape, some deliberately left unrestored, others are beautifully restored. They do give you good maps, and there are these panels distributed around the museum that are very good for showing you what you're looking at. This is a World War I Newport French fighter plane. A couple of my favorites here in the early aviation side of things is this early World War I two-engine observation plane that was later on used as the first, if not, or maybe one of the first planes that was used as a bomber, just by opening a little hatch in the floor and dropping a bomb through it. Carried a crew of two, one to fire the two machine guns and the other one to fly the thing, and they were notoriously easy shot down by the Germans. And then this miraculous contraption here. I want to say this is a Langley flyer, but I have to double check that. This is Samuel Langley's aerodrome, which was a attempt that he made to come up with a heavier than air flying machine, and it was only slightly successful. Not so much as the Wright brothers, of course. I believe there was some contention at one point about whether or not this plane would really be considered the first one to fly, but that claim has been relinquished, and nobody seems to seriously challenge the Wright brothers anymore. But it's still a very cool looking airplane. Another of the most famous airplanes in the museum is, of course, the Enola Gay, the B-29, which dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It's raised up off the ground partially just because of its status, but also because of its notorious nature. There's been a number of instances where people have tried to deface the airplane, in effect blaming it for their perceptions of the use of the bomb, and rather inappropriate for a historical artifact to be treated that way. But I believe they intended, by raising it up like this, to put it out of the reach of people who might try to do damage to it, or maybe just, you know, pat it down with their hands and leave a lot of corrosive finger oils and things, but I think primarily to avoid vandalism. But it also puts it in a very nice position to be viewed better than most of the airplanes. You can see it from underneath as well as from above from the mezzanine catwalk. They also had an incident where some people threw paint at it, and so the part of the airplane that's closest to the mezzanine is protected by a Lexan barrier. Makes it a little more difficult to throw things directly at it. They do have the cockpit lit up fairly nicely, so you can get some idea what it looked like inside. Viewers of this video can check my channel and see my video from inside the Commemorative Air Force's B-29 Fifi to get a better idea what these look like inside during flight. There's some more World War II aircraft down here, and some very interesting German aircraft from World War II over in this section of the floor. Aircraft such as this Junkers here in Lufthansa livery. I've always liked this, along with the Ford Tri-Motor, which are very contemporaneous airplanes and very similar in style, except for the Ford Tri-Motor having a high wing instead of a low wing. And one of Boeing's first all-metal passenger airplanes. I'll detail that in a little bit in greater detail. There's a Concorde back there, and also an extremely important airplane, the Boeing -80, which is the prototype for all of Boeing's commercial airliners. This is the one they built to test the concepts, and it was never put into production. The fuselage was too narrow and so on, and they enlarged it somewhat to come up with the 707, which of course was a very popular early jet transport. But this is the very airplane that Tex Johnston barrel rolled twice as a demonstration of the flight worthiness of the airplane. And that video can be viewed on YouTube. One thing I do appreciate about this particular museum is that, unlike so many other air museums, including the Air Force Museum, it is equipped with lots of catwalks to allow views from above the airplanes. So many of them you're stuck walking around underneath of them, looking up and hardly getting an idea what the planes really look like. And to their credit here, they anticipated that need. One of the things they've added to the museum since I was here last, or maybe it was here but just not easily viewable at that time, is a restoration facility where you can watch planes that are slated for display in the museum being restored.
This one here is part of the missing stuff. Since this was damaged, this whole section is completely missing here. So what I did was I used this form to bend a new bow in the correct shape. Now to be able to do this, this is spinning world pivot, 25,000 series. Now in order to bend this, what I do is I use a low temperature red, and what I do is I plug my hand. What that does is supports the whole inside of this thing so it won't kick. So that way I can bend it. I'll do
One nice thing about the restoration gallery is that they tell you what's being worked on at any given moment. And they also have a video with the various restoring technicians talking about what they're working on at the moment and discussing some of the problems they have and how they're going about solving them. Then the back mezzanine wraps around and gives a good view of the space gallery. I'll touch on this a little bit later in the video, but there's a European Space Agency experimental module, which could be carried in the shuttle and attached to the space station. Numerous satellite types. The Space Shuttle Discovery, which replaced the Space Shuttle Enterprise, which was here for many years. Unfortunately, I have to see if I can put a comment in I took the tour earlier in the day, even though I didn't really need to, and our docent was giving all sorts of misinformation about this and the Enterprise. He had things very confused. That's often the case with docents, I find. They may have memorized the facts at one point, but over time and much repeating, they let small details slip, and then they remember them in the incorrect way and keep repeating them that way, and it gets more and more corrupted. So I may mention some of that to somebody if I can figure out who to mention it to. But really a highlight of the museum is being able to see a real flown space shuttle up close like this. And they have a small gallery of flown and not flown early American capsules, Mercury and Gemini. I believe the Mercury capsule they have down here is the backup for Alan Shepard's original, in case they had to do another flight, but they didn't need to, so they did not use this particular one, but it's representative of the first flown Mercury. And there's the experimental model when they were thinking about bringing the Gemini in on a parasail wing instead of on parachutes. This is the original mobile quarantine facility that they used for Apollo 11 to put the astronauts in as soon as they got off the capsule on the aircraft carrier. They were put in here, and it was taken from the aircraft carrier to Hawaii, and there put on a transport aircraft and flown back to the continental US. And after they'd been quarantined for long enough, they were allowed to leave. But this is not a mock-up or a backup, it's the one they were actually in. One thing I wanted to mention is some people have been confused, and probably many are still confused. They don't realize that the National Air and Space Museum, which is also known as the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, is actually two facilities. There's the one on the Mall in Washington, D.C. That's probably the better known of the two. It's also the older one. And it has some extremely important artifacts in it, but it doesn't have a lot of space to put full-size large airplanes in it. And then there's this facility, the Steven Udvar-Hazy facility out at Dulles Airport, which is something on the order of 45 minutes by interstate highway west from Washington, D.C. So a bit of a drive. You can get out here by public transportation. I believe they used to run shuttle buses. My understanding is they no longer do, and you just have to either drive yourself or use public transportation. That situation may change on and off as funds are available or what other variables there may be, but you really need to spend the better part of a day at each of the museums to even come close to seeing everything. As I mentioned before, there are these high and low level mezzanine type catwalks that give good views of the aircraft from above, and they are accessible by elevators and by regular stairs and also by sloped walkways, so they've really done a nice job with that. Another thing I wanted to mention is that just as with the Air and Space Museum on the Mall in DC, this one at Udvar-Hazy is open and free to the public. They do not charge for it. However, if you want to park in the parking lot here, it's a $15 per vehicle hit. Apparently that is a fee charged by the airport authority, not by the museum. I heard that they kick back part of that to the museum anyway as sort of a donation, but The museum itself does not charge. Having said that, the museum does charge for the movies they show. If you're a museum member or a Smithsonian Air and Space Museum member, which you get just by buying or subscribing to their magazine, I think it's less than $30 a year. You get a substantial decrease in the cost of the movie tickets if you want to take those in while you're visiting. One of my favorite airplanes here is the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a very important early attempt to rocket power fighter aircraft. Mostly experimental, but they did try using them in combat. This is in a somewhat unrestored state by, well, for a philosophical reason, that they didn't want to have certain pieces restored to a condition they almost wouldn't have been in when they were new. And I really appreciate having it in sort of a rough condition here. They also have on display here the rocket motor that was used to propel the aircraft, the HWK 109-509A1. Continuing on into the James McDonnell Space Hangar, which we've already viewed from above. Obviously the Space Shuttle Discovery is the centerpiece. And I do like the fact that they've got a flown shuttle here instead of the Enterprise, which of course was flown as a drop airplane to test its flying characteristics as a glider, but it was not equipped with the rocket engines and never flew into space. It was a very pristine looking space shuttle. Didn't have all the scars from, you know, many missions. And I like the fact that they decided to keep the Discovery more or less in the condition it was when it finished its last flight, with all the scarring and patches and streaks from the re-entry. One thing that I like about this, and I'm one of those guys who crawls under airplanes in museums and looks up into the landing gear wells. I find all the mechanisms to be almost as fascinating as the whole rest of the airplane, but how conventional the landing gear is on the shuttle. Everything that you see under here looks just like it does on a modern jetliner, or even some propeller airliners from, you know, the 50s, for example. There's essentially nothing different here except for the extra thickness on the doors. Instead of a thin aluminum sheet metal cover for the landing gear, there's this big thick layer with the thermal tiles and insulation and so on. But once you get inside there, it's just aluminum panels, you know, nothing all that special. I'm sure they did some things different. You know, there might be different fluids involved, different gaskets, a little higher rated, but still the basic design is very conventional.
And sand. And once they land, each one has its own number. Yeah. And so this is the tile. And
I don't know who the person is who was giving that little private tour right there, but I just could have sworn I heard them say the tiles on the shuttle were made out of styrofoam. It's like, I don't think that's right. There's a lot of people in these museums giving very misinformed advice to other people. Another thing I appreciate about having a really flown space-ready version of the shuttle is all these other things, like the big connectors they had on the side are all visible.
nicest guy in the world.
All the used maneuvering engines.
I do 300 back here. Wrap around.
And the final liftoff of the Discovery. We did that with
They don't have anything saying so, but I believe these are the connection points for the fuel lines coming from the external tank, which presumably would be shut off after detachment of the tank. I guess they do that when they're in space, because if they tried to swing those doors at high speed, I suppose there'd be issues. But maybe I don't see any other place where they would get that fuel in, so I'm guessing that's what those are.
Go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and the final liftoff of Discovery. A tribute to the dedication, hard work, and pride of America's space shuttle team. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Space shuttle now rolling over onto its back for the 87-minute ride into orbit. Discovery now making one last reach for the stars.
So this again is the Mercury capsule, Freedom 7-2. So it was the backup capsule to Alan Shepard's first flight. Another important and flown capsule is Gemini 7, which is the one that Frank Borman and Jim Lovell flew in for 14 days in space back in 1965. They have this one covered with plexiglass because of its significance, but that always makes it hard to take pictures of it. But it's the real McCoy. And this is the Gemini experimental paraglider capsule, which I mentioned earlier. Instead of parachutes, it was going to have pop-out landing gear and the big inflatable parasail and even a nose landing gear. But I believe this was never flown in its intended way, and I'm not sure that the final expected version of this was going to have a landing gear. This was a towed vehicle here that they built to tow behind another aircraft just to test the parasail and its handling characteristics. Back on the ground floor over on the Korean and Vietnam War, Cold War side of things, one of the things I appreciate about this collection is they tend to have the contemporaneous examples of the Soviet and American sides of things. For example, a MiG-15 up next to an F-86, and over on this side a F-4 Phantom II next to its counterpart, the MiG-21. The historic Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star, the Vought Crusader. I always thought this was one of the prettier airplanes that they had from that period, at least the front part of it was. And they have the prototype of the joint, what do they call it, the Joint Task Fighter? I'm trying to think of the designation. Anyway, it's the Lockheed Martin X-35, and meaning experimental, but it's the the Joint Strike Fighter. I think that's what they actually were going to call it. And there's different versions of it for the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy. I wonder how much money they spent on this PA system. It's so echoey, it's hard to understand what they're saying. Not very successful. Anyway, they have the propulsion system for the Joint Strike Fighter, including the main engine with its adjustable thrust rear end and the intermediate lift fan for hovering if it's the Marine version. Some nice examples of helicopters, but not a lot of them. F-100 Super Sabre. And again, if you're an engine person, The pristine examples they have here are very interesting. Got a Bell UH-1H Huey, the Bell AH-1F Cobra. This is got the rotors taken off and some other hardware missing. A SAM guided missile. And this would be the Thud, the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. And of course, once again, the SR-71, probably the most photographed airplane in the museum. Everybody wants to be photographed with it. You've got the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. I always thought that was a pretty cool airplane. And the Northrop NM-1, which was a sort of prototypical flying wing design that preceded their larger bomber-sized flying wings. As I recall, somebody still flies one of these somewhere, that they have one they use in air shows. It may not be this exact model, but it's a similar small Northrop flying wing. But here's one. They do give the guided tours here, and they leave fairly often. But again, in my experience, you have to watch what the docents say, because they're not always totally accurate in what they say to their tour group. I always love the World War II German airplane section, DO335 file. This observation gyrocopter that could be towed behind ships and submarines to get a higher view of the surrounding seascape. And the Orado Blitz, the AR-234. The Focke-Wulf FW-190. They're working on the Horton back in the lab, but they do mention it here. It's being restored. They have this piece of it out on display at the moment, but we saw the wings when we were looking at the restoration hangar. Again, a very important airplane in commercial transportation. Lots of unusual airplanes, gliders, mail planes, stunt planes, executive jets, hobby jets, stunt planes, all hanging from the ceiling. Microplanes, like the Sky Baby and one of the Beatty microplanes. Looks like something by Rutan there. I'm not sure which one that is. And this was one I looked at earlier from higher up, the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, which was sort of a commercial version of the B-17 built after the war. The wings and engines, and I believe the tail section, were essentially those of a B-17, but it had a much rounder fuselage. It was not very successful. If I recall correctly, this is one that Boeing had completely restored, and then they were doing some flying of it around Seattle and lost an engine or engines or something and had to land it in the bay, had it fished out, and then had to restore it again before bringing it here. Still a very cool and unique airplane. I'm not sure that there's any of these anywhere else. Of course, a number of museums have Concords. Most of them you don't get to see as close as you do in this museum. It's right there and you walk straight under it. I'm checking the time here so I have time to go to my movie that's scheduled next. One of the early vertical lift experimental planes that preceded the Osprey that the Marines use now. And one of the Air Force variants of the beautiful Lockheed Constellation, or the Super Constellation actually. If you're into helicopters, there's some more very interesting types back here. I always like museums that have these converted cars where you can ostensibly drive it around like a car and then hook it up and make it into an airplane. I don't think any of them are really practical for most people, just for people who are willing to give up all practicality in the name of having something that they can say is a car and an airplane. This is the landing gear off of an Airbus A330, A340. Kind of cool. It's cutaway. You can see the oleo struts and so on. This is one of my favorites here, the North American Rockwell Shrike Commander. This is the one that Bob Hoover flew in air shows doing aerobatics in a plane decidedly not intended for aerobatic use. And a Dassault Falcon 20. This was, I think, the plane that started FedEx off. The first kind they used. Nicely restored small cargo airplane. Besides the IMAX Theater, another feature of this museum is the Donald Engel Tower, which perversely requires you to go downstairs in order to get the elevator to go up into the tower. Never really understood that, but
How you doing?
all right. So leaving the elevator for the tower, get a nice view in all directions. You've got the distant mountain range off to the west. Got the museum hangar itself. This is looking towards the south. And their sizable parking lot. I wonder if they ever come close to filling that up. Most times when I've been here, well, every time I've been here before, it's maybe twice that number of cars that I've ever seen, but I hear they do have busy days. And the tower is not circular, it's kind of oblong. And facing towards the north is the Dulles Airport, with both runways visible.
traffic control. It's pretty good money, but I mean, it's not outrageous.
Safety is a good thing. The tiny little.
But their job is to.
What's that place coming in there?
Oh yeah, I knew that.
It's going to change it to something else.
The afternoon triage, and then wanted to do a morning mix, time change. We came back, we left there like mid-morning, and got here like mid-afternoon, something like that. Again, the time change, so.
They gotta give you a picture.
No, they're more than north-south,
And
I'm
they
not
come,
sure.
they come in this way.
They come in.
The Baldwin Red Devil, a Curtiss N9H, the Fowler gauge biplane, this is that twin-engine World War I bomber I saw earlier, the Caudron G4. And of course, the SPAD 16. I've always loved the Dash 80, or really it's the Boeing 367-80 is the proper name. It's so much like modern commercial jet transports, but so different in some other ways. Since the Dash 80 was only a prototype and was not set up to carry passengers, it only has a few windows, but they're these tiny little oval windows. But the the cockpit area is just like the later Boeings, and details of the landing gear and so on. Big old Pratt and Whitney engines. A few more shots of the Enola Gay. And when I was talking about it just a moment ago, I kept calling it the Junkers, and that's what it is, but I didn't mention its designation, which was a Ju-52, or Junkers 52. Beautiful airplane. Just some filler material here tacked on at the end. I've been on several Concords before in museums, different places. But one thing that always astounds me is how tiny they are inside. It's really a claustrophobic airplane. It's a good thing they didn't have to be on it for very long. But you can see those tiny little windows, almost hardly worth even having them. There's this little area off to the side that I think a lot of people probably miss. Basically hot air balloon cabins and gondolas of various sorts. And this was the pressurized gondola for a couple of aborted attempts to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. Good attempts, but ultimately unsuccessful in the ultimate goal. And this is the gondola from one of the earlier Goodyear airships. The gondola from the Raven Volcoon is overhead, hanging from the rafters. This is the Breitling Orbiter 3 gondola, flown by Brian Jones and Bertrand Piccard, the first successful hot air balloon flight around the world in 1999. Various models and mock-ups and pieces of airships. This says it's the fuel tank of the Norge, which is a airship of note. Some of the fabric from the Hindenburg. The girder section from the crashed Zeppelin Shenandoah. Well, I'm not sure the Shenandoah is actually a Zeppelin. It was definitely a dirigible. I'm not sure if it was built by Zeppelin or not. And here's a girder fragment from the Hindenburg. And the capsule from the Red Bull Stratus. This is the capsule that Felix Baumgartner dropped from to set the world record for the highest parachute jump. And there are some Japanese aircraft represented from World War II, like the Nakajima J1N1S Gecko or Irving, the Kugisho Oka Model 22, which was sort of a flying bomb, the nose and tail sections of a Kyushu Shinden, and a wingless Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, otherwise known as Nick. And my favorite, the Aichi Seiran, which was a airplane that was designed to come apart and be stowed in a watertight compartment on a submarine, be brought up close to an enemy shore, assembled, floated on the water, taken off, and drop its bombs. I believe none of these were actually ever used to attack anything, and this is apparently the only one in the world to still exist. And way back there is an engineless Nakajima Kika twin jet powered aircraft, and a Kawasaki Shidenkai, otherwise known as George. And certainly not an aircraft, but something that a lot of visitors like is the model of the mothership from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is the actual model that they built for the movie. These antennas sticking out here are actually made from street lights from model train kit parts, or what they'd use to decorate the track layouts. You know, little pieces of cranes, probably from battleship models, tanks of various sorts from various models. The top was apparently inspired by an oil refinery, and all the surface decoration and just various bits of glued on stuff. It's been pointed out many times that the model builders had some fun with things, and I don't know all of them, but I know there's a few. For example, there's a little model of a TIE fighter there from Star Wars. It's a little model of R2-D2. This is a rather special display. This is the actual visor assembly and gloves worn by Neil Armstrong when he was on the moon. They apparently keep this in a very controlled climate most of the time and only rarely take it out for display. Anyway, there's certainly a lot more here at this museum than I've bothered to highlight, but I think that should give any potential future visitor a good overview. Okay, we're now on the mall in Washington, D.C., and it's time to visit the National Air and Space Museum, the main facility, not to be confused with the Steven Udvar-Hazy facility at Dulles Airport. This museum is located at the southeastern corner of the mall. And of course it has the United States Capitol building at its very east end. And the Washington Monument in its center, and many more monuments at its far west end over by the Potomac River, and the famous Smithsonian Castle over here. This is, of course, the main location, whereas the Udvar-Hazy is the remote location. As soon as we enter the foyer, or the foyer, we find the Voyager, the Jaeger and Rutan airplane that was the first to go around the world non-stop, unrefueled. And for the, what is it, the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, the model that was used for the photography on the original series TV show, just restored a couple of months ago. Wired up for lights. The central area of the museum is the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall, which has some of the most important aircraft ever produced and flown. There's Spaceship One, the first commercial spaceship to get outside the Earth's atmosphere. Chuck Yeager's plane, Glamorous Glennis, the first airplane to break the sound barrier. The Boeing XP-59 Era Comet. I forgot to mention that the designation of Glamorous Glennis was the X-1. Here are two of the very early jet engines. The one developed by the Germans, by Junkers, and the one developed by Frank Whittle in England, the so-called W1X. And this was Robert Goddard's, one of Robert Goddard's early rocket engines from the year 1926. And here's one of the backup or support models that was kept on Earth for the Viking lander that was sent up in 1976, the first U.S. spacecraft to reach the surface of Mars. This is the original Mercury Friendship 7, the spacecraft that John Glenn flew in to become the first American to orbit the Earth. This is the actual artifact. This is the original artifact, Gemini 4, which was the spacecraft that carried Ed White when he did his first American spacewalk. And overhead we have a representation of Explorer, the United States' first artificial satellite, and a representation of Sputnik, the Soviet Union's first artificial satellite. This is LM number 2. It is a real lunar module, but it's one of the early ones that was only built to the standards necessary for testing in low Earth orbit. It was not built to the later standards for actually going to the moon and landing on it. But essentially it's a operational lunar module. This one, of course, never flew. It was kept on Earth for testing purposes, especially, I believe, drop tests to test the legs and so on, because it would have the full weight and it could be used for those purposes. There are, of course, no flown lunar modules that exist anymore. They either burned up in Earth atmosphere or they crashed into the moon after their missions were complete. This is one of 2 fans that was used at NASA's wind tunnel. The larger one that was used for testing full-sized aircraft models. Here's the Soviet SS-20 Pioneer nuclear-tipped ballistic missile. And next to it, the United States similar missile, the Pershing II. One thing that I find the museum on the Mall is a little bit more kid-friendly, like this child-oriented hall on how things fly. They don't really have anything like that at the Udvar-Hazy facility. That's more of a what I'd call just a serious, straightforward airplane museum, where the one on the Mall is a big tourist attraction, and it just seems like the orientation is slightly different, but it's still an amazing place. On the maps, this is called the Space Race Hall, but it's a little bit different. It's got a actual V2 rocket, an assortment of US rockets that lofted satellites and so on into orbit and beyond. It has a World War II German V1 buzz bomb. A example of the Apollo-Soyuz test project joint mission, showing the Soyuz and the Apollo. This was done after the Apollo missions to the moon were completed, and they were using up some equipment that wasn't going to be used for anything more elaborate, and they did this friendship mission. There's a mock-up of the Hubble Space Telescope. And of course, one of the crown jewels of the museum, the original Apollo 11 command module.
Cameras and images of Hubble has left off and dramatically expanded the science campaign.
They used to have this one surrounded by plexiglass in the main entrance, and it's been relocated to this position since I was here last, and instead of being surrounded by plexiglass, it's simply moved further away from where people can easily get at it, which is probably a good thing. It was too hard to see before. rising above me is, I believe it's a flight-ready but unused example of Skylab. It appears to have all the actual parts on it, so I suspect this is one that they built as a backup or study model or something. In the Looking at Earth gallery, they have a de Havilland DH-4, which was a high altitude for the time, downward-looking photography platform. And in the same gallery is a Lockheed U-2 spy plane. And there's a nice display of various types of high-altitude cameras and models of spy and communication satellites, weather satellites.
Today, weather satellites help us locate and track major storms around the globe so that we can warn.
Not much in the way of actual artifacts there, except for the two airplanes. Another iconic aircraft in the main hall is the Spirit of St. Louis that Charles Lindbergh flew in to become the first person to fly across the Atlantic nonstop. There's the Samuel Langley Gallery of Early Flight. Again, not too many actual artifacts in here, but there are some. The Langley quarter-scale aerodrome. We'd seen the full-size one in the Udvar-Hazy Museum. A model of the aerial steam carriage. And the Stringfellow triplane. And the Lilienthal hang glider. The Hargrove ornithopter. The Langley Aerodrome number 5, and I believe this is the original Wright Brothers 1909 military flyer. And also I believe this is an original Curtiss headless pusher biplane. One of the early competitors to the Wright brothers. And this is the Blériot 11. This particular example of the Blériot 11 was one that flew primarily in the Americas, although it did do a tour in Europe, Latin America, and so on. Flew in the United States quite a bit. It was one of many examples of the type that were made. So it is an original, but it's not the one that Blériot himself flew. There's a small collection of early airplane engines. A Kemp G2 at Adams Farewell. A Murray. It's a nice little gallery. Not very large, but has some interesting pieces in it. Next door is the Jet Aviation Gallery. There's a McDonnell FH-1 Phantom hanging from the ceiling, or actually suspended on pylons. Some cutaways of different types of jet engines. An authentic Messerschmitt ME-262. A Lockheed XP-80. The prototype for America's first practical jet airplane. One of the many types of airplanes designed by a team headed by Clarence, aka Kelly Johnson, who also worked on the Lightning and the U-2 and the SR-71, other notable airplanes. Some more examples of cockpit instrumentation. Some modern turbine engines. Another gallery that's not very large but still very interesting. They do have a simulator rides area, much like they do at the Udvar-Hazy facility, really just for kids. This is the America by Air gallery, which is really, for the most part, viewed better from the mezzanine level. And I'll hit that later. They do have the front end of a actual Boeing 747 that you can go into and look in the cockpit. And also the front section of, what is this guy? It's a DC-4 maybe? Perhaps it's a DC-7. I don't see where it actually says. Yeah, it's a little bigger. I think this is probably more like a DC-6 or a DC-7. Whatever it is, this is an interesting cutaway showing the airplane structure. Just the simple skin with some insulation on it, very thin skin. The semi-monocoque ribbing, structural element, this honeycomb structure for the baggage racks. Typical airline toilet of the day. Example of what the seating might have been like. Okay, it does show here it's a DC-7. I think in many ways I'd still rather travel on these than in the modern jets. Perfectly safe, not as fast, but I think more enjoyable in many ways. A nice cutaway model of the Boeing 314. Well, I've been on the Spruce Goose and other airplanes like the Martin Mars, all of which I've considered myself fortunate to have been on. I sure wish they would have saved at least one of these magnificent airplanes. Sometimes I wonder about the wisdom of how everybody just wants to scrap everything when they don't have a use for it anymore. It's a pretty good sized gift shop for those people who are so inclined. And so that's a circuit of everything on the lower level. One can take a tour of a broken escalator. On both sides of the museum, or both sides of the main entrance, are sets of up and down escalators. There must be stairs somewhere, but I didn't see them. The escalators are very obvious and easy to use. So this takes me up at the so this gets us up to the America by Air exhibit, second level. So a sample of the modern airplane lavatory. And an old style 747 cockpit, the old pre-glass cockpit style, all the steam gauges. Ford tri-motor. We saw the contemporaneous Junkers over at the Udvar-Hazy Museum. And straight ahead is a DC-3. Down there is a Boeing 247, which was, I think, their first attempt to make a modern all-metal commercial transport, and many of the design features on this airplane were enlarged to make the Boeing B-17 a U.S. mail plane.
It had two.
Here's a Pitcairn PA-5 mail wing used for airmail, 1927. Hanging from the ceiling is the original MacCready Gossamer Condor, which won the prize for being the first human-powered aircraft capable of sustained, controllable flight. There's a small World War II gallery. The Udvar-Hazy Museum is much better represented in this regard. Have a Supermarine Spitfire, something which is not over at Udvar-Hazy. Have a P-51 Mustang here.
What's the one above it?
And overhead a Mach-E C-202 Lightning.
The fighters came with them to France. That's such a short range that they would have to turn around, or they would run out of gas to fight it. Then they were left off to the engine.
And overhead a Mitsubishi Zero. All indications is that this is probably an original one. And down here a Messerschmitt 109. There's a nice gallery on sea-air operations, supposedly representing a aircraft carrier hangar deck. There's a Grumman F4F, otherwise known as the FM1 or the Wildcat. There's a Douglas Dauntless overhead. There's a Boeing F4B4, early American fighter plane, and straight ahead is the Douglas A4C Skyhawk. Pretty nicely mocked up in here to look like a hangar deck. Oh, what's upstairs? Some better views of some of the airplanes. And a mock-up with some real artifacts of a aircraft carrier command deck or bridge with some nice movies showing an approximated view. That's a nice touch. And some more exhibits. There are some drones over here. The RQ-14A Dragon Eye, remote controlled. The Pioneer UAV RQ-2A Pioneer. The Lockheed Martin / Boeing Dark Star. And the Predator, and the Boeing X-45 drone, and the RQ-7A Shadow 200. Unfortunately, it's hard to get a good exposure in here with all the backlighting. Ahead on the left is the planetarium. I think I went in there one time when I visited. It was a nice enough planetarium. But it always seemed kind of odd to be stuck in here when I thought the space would be better used by showing more airplanes. Here's the Great War in the Air gallery. I should note that most of these galleries are quite cool in them. And if you just come in with a t-shirt or a polo shirt, you're probably going to be too cold and freezing the whole time. I think they keep it cold to better preserve the artifacts, and the lighting is also very low, so I don't remember seeing anything about not taking flash pictures, but I don't see anybody taking flash pictures, so maybe I missed the signs. Anyway, it can be a little difficult in here to get good pictures. And you're advised to wear a jacket or a sweater. A lot of these exhibits are also very closely coupled, and it's hard to get far enough away, even with a good lens like I have on this camera. It's hard to get far enough away to get the whole airplane in the picture. Hanging upside down from the ceiling is Patty Wagstaff's Extra 260 aerobatic airplane that she flew so famously. This is the Pioneers of Flight Gallery. This is a model of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's concept of a spacecraft that could travel to the moon.
So they started looking for the by the way, President Roosevelt said that
Mostly a big rocket engine with fuel stored there. Instrumentation room. Those motors are apparently fuel pumps. Acceleration couches, controls, just like some of the old science fiction movies. Pretty cool model, actually. This is a model of the first manned aerial vehicle, the Montgolfier hot air balloon.
so she's talking to on voice radio. Sometimes there's a 20-mile-an-hour.
This is the original Explorer 2 gondola from a hot air balloon that achieved a altitude record that lasted for something like 20 years back in 1935. Has a pressurized section and an open section on top. Several more types of hot air balloon gondolas. This is the Lockheed Vega that Amelia Earhart used to set a couple of her world records. This is the Douglas World Cruiser Chicago, which was one of the planes used for the first flight around the world. Of course, it wasn't a continuous flight. It involved a period of about 170 some odd days and involved 8 Army Air Service pilots, mechanics, and 4 airplanes that flew from Seattle and circumnavigated the world. Army Air Service, 2 pilots flew this airplane in the first non-stop flight across the United States, starting in Long Island, New York, and ending in San Diego, California. This is a Lockheed Model 8 Sirius, which was bought by Charles Lindbergh and his wife and used for many of their flights after he became rich and famous. And of course, right across the hallway is the Spirit of St. Louis, which we already looked at. This airplane overhead is the Vin Fiz, or Vin Fiz, which was sponsored by William Randolph Hearst and was the first, or was the airplane used in the first flight across the U.S., although it was not a non-stop flight. They actually took many days and had many landings and several crashes along the way.
American military.
But the airplane did make it across the country and therefore became the first airplane to do so. This is the Wright Brothers Gallery. Overhead is a reproduction of the 1899 kite built by the Wright brothers, but it is a reproduction, it's not the original artifact. They have a couple of reproductions of some of the earlier Wright brother gliders. The centerpiece of this exhibit is the original 1903 Wright Flyer, the first airplane to carry humans and achieve sustained, controllable flight. I think this one used to hang in the main entrance, although in reality it's sort of like half of George Washington's hatchet. All of the fabric has been replaced back in the 80s. But presumably all the woodwork and the engine and the propellers and so on are original. This is the Apollo to the Moon Gallery, which has been rearranged since I was here last. They have an original Saturn V F1 engine.
The underneath side of them suckers.
Of course, they only have the one, not the 5 that were originally here, but they do have a quarter of one cut out and placed in position and then surrounded by mirrors. So one gets the impression that they're all there. Doesn't really show up on the camera so well, but when you stand here, it looks like you're inside a cluster of the engines. There's a lunar module cockpit in there with a recorded out the window video, but it's so dark to presumably protect the artifact that you can't hardly see anything. They have some of the fuel cells here used, and a instrument panel from the Apollo command module. Lots of the astronaut tools and equipment used on Apollo. There's a nice gallery of the different Mercury and Gemini flights. The lunar rover and some of the equipment that they set up on the moon. And overhead is the original artifact Apollo command module from the Skylab 4 mission. They have a gallery called A New Moon Rises, views from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter camera. This is a fairly new exhibit.
Do you have what it takes? Take control of a state-of-the-art fighter jet for air-to-air combat, or choose to travel into space to a space station. Flight simulators are located.
They have either mock-ups or duplicates of several of the early satellites, the Ranger, the Lunar Orbiter, Surveyor, and a small exhibit on how we get from here to there, the way we measure time and navigation. This aircraft in the back is one of the Northrop M2F3 lifting bodies, which was used to test how aircraft could re-enter from space. Much of this information went into the space shuttle design. A couple of models that I've seen here before, and every time it's been in a different location, but now it's in the Space Race Gallery. There's a nice model of the Saturn V and the Soviet N1, which was going to be their moon rocket, but it was never successfully launched. Reportedly, the N1 was slightly more powerful, but not as good in a number of other ways, and certainly not reliable enough to actually work. There's a Soyuz capsule. An experimental Soviet capsule called the Almaz.
More stability and more power to propulsion systems, replacing accelerator.
And just like with the Udvar-Hazy Museum, the only restaurant at the main Air and Space Museum is a McDonald's, but they also list a Boston Market and a Donata's Pizza.